Some topics they're really tough to talk about, but it's essential that we understand them. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the absolute darkest chapters in the history of science and medicine. We're talking about times when that quest for knowledge completely lost its way, and the human consequences were just devastating. So, let's get into it. So that's really the question at the heart of all of this. It's a question that scientists, governments, and really all of us have had to grapple with, usually after a terrible price has already been paid. And today, we're going to explore the stories of the people who paid that price. Okay, so to get through this complex and heavy history, we've broken it down into 5 parts. We'll kick things off by setting an ethical baseline, then we'll move through these awful experiments that were driven by war, by prejudice, and even by pure curiosity, before we get to the final part, the ethical reckoning. Right, before we can really, truly grasp the horror of what went so wrong, we gotta be crystal clear on what right even looks like. There's one core principle that's supposed to be the guardrail for all ethical research, and it's a principle that was violated in every single case we're about to discuss. Informed consent. I mean, it sounds simple, right? But it's everything. It is the absolute bedrock of medical ethics. It means you, me, all of us have the right to know exactly what's being done to our bodies, what the dangers are, and to be able to say no at any time without any pressure. Without this, science can become a form of tyranny. Its absence? Well, it's the ghost that haunts every single story we're about to tell. So in this first section, we're going to see what happens when that core principle just gets thrown out the window during times of war. When you're desperate to get an edge, moral compasses can get really warped, and the state can decide that certain knowledge is so important that the rights of individuals, well, they just don't matter as much. Let's go back to World War II. In occupied China, the Imperial Japanese Army had this secret biological and chemical warfare research facility. It was called Unit 731, and its entire purpose was to develop the most horrific weapons imaginable, and it used human beings to test them. And the cruelty here, it was systematic. This wasn't random violence. This was a methodical research program. They deliberately infected prisoners with diseases like the plague and cholera just to see how the diseases would progress. They performed vivisections. That's dissecting people while they are still alive, with no anesthesia, so they could watch the organs function in real time. They tested the absolute limits of the human body with frostbite with extreme pressure. They even used people as living targets for grenades and flamethrowers. We'll never know the exact number. They made sure of that by destroying the records. But historians figure that tens of thousands of Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, even children, died inside Unit 731. And what's just unbelievable is that after the war, some of the unit's leaders were actually given immunity by the Allied powers. Why? In exchange for their research data. And look, this wasn't just happening on one side of the war. Over in the United Kingdom, there was a plan called Operation Vegetarian, designed to wipe out German food supplies using anthrax. To test this weapon, the British military just unleashed anthrax spores on a place called Grunard Island. It got so contaminated that it was quarantined for almost 50 years. And the soldiers who were involved, they were often tricked, told it was just a training exercise, only to end up with chronic health problems for the rest of their lives. This slide, man, it just perfectly shows the gap between what they said and what they were actually doing. During the Cold War, the U.S. military had this thing called the San Jose Project. Officially, it was all about safety training, but in reality, it was about exposing their own soldiers to some of the most dangerous chemical agents ever made, like VX nerve gas. The participants often had no clue what they were being exposed to, and here's a really disturbing detail. Some were picked specifically based on their race, because of a totally flawed theory that darker skin might give them more protection. Okay, let's shift gears to our next section. Here, the reason for the cruelty wasn't winning a war, it was something even more sinister. It was the belief that some human beings are just less than others, because when prejudice puts on a lab coat, the results are just monstrous. There are some names in history that they feel heavy with evil, and Dr. Joseph Mengele is one of them. At the Auschwitz concentration camp, he used his position as a doctor to run experiments that had zero scientific merit. They were driven by nothing more than a grotesque obsession with eugenics and racial purity, and his main focus was twins. What Mengele did was all about completely dehumanizing people, especially children. He would perform these agonizing surgeries, even amputations on kids without any anesthesia. He would inject a disease like typhus into one twin just so he could use the other as a control group. He literally tried to change children's eye colors by injecting chemicals straight into their eyeballs, which caused blinding pain and, well, often blindness. And in his most twisted experiments, he actually tried to surgically sew twins together to create artificial conjoined twins. So you have about 3,000 kids, 3,000 individual twins, who went through his labs. Only around 200 made it out alive. It wasn't research, it was a factory of torture and death. And Mengele? He escaped after the war and was never, ever held accountable for his crimes. This timeline, it's just a perfect, tragic example of how one terrible decision can ripple out for decades. Back in 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service started a study on 600 poor African-American sharecroppers to see what happens when syphilis goes untreated. The men were told they were getting treatment for bad blood, but they never got any real medicine. Then, in the 1940s, penicillin became the standard effective cure. The researchers knew it, and they actively hid it from the men so they could keep their study going. This went on for 40 years, until a whistleblower finally exposed the whole thing in 1972. The human cost was just staggering, spreading through families across generations. Now we go to apartheid-era South Africa, where the military had a program called the Aversion Project. The sickness they were trying to cure was homosexuality. Gay and lesbian soldiers were shipped off to a secret psychiatric ward where they were tortured, and it was all disguised as therapy. The whole process was this brutal form of conditioning. They used extreme pain from electric shocks and drugs that made them violently ill to try and force the brain to associate being gay with trauma. It was a vicious attempt to use psychology as a weapon against someone's very identity. All right, so now we're going to look at a motivation that's a little different, but honestly, no less disturbing. In these cases, the goal wasn't to win a war or enforce some prejudice. The main driver was just the pursuit of knowledge itself, with absolutely no moral or ethical breaks. The Soviet Union had this secret lab. Its name was chillingly simple: the camera, the chamber. Its one and only mission was to create poisons that were tasteless, odorless, and couldn't be detected in an autopsy. And to do this, they tested them on political prisoners. The process was cold, clinical. A victim was given a poison, and the scientists would just watch, taking detailed notes as the person suffered, through convulsions, paralysis, and finally a terrible death. The subject wasn't a person. They were just a data point. You might think this is all a modern problem, right? But let's go way, way back, all the way to ancient Greece. Herophilus and Erasistratus are often called the fathers of anatomy. They made incredible discoveries about our nervous system and our veins. But their method? It was vivisection, performed on condemned criminals. They would literally cut into living people to see how nerves made muscles twitch, or to watch a heartbeat inside an open chest. It really makes you ask a tough question. How much of our basic medical knowledge is built on a foundation of unbelievable cruelty? So after going through all these horrible stories, you have to ask, right? What's the takeaway? I mean, things like the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, all the review boards we have today, they all grew out of the ashes of these tragedies. But what are the common threads, the warning signs we have to always be watching for? When you look at all of them together, the patterns they jump right out at you. In every single one, there was a total lack of informed consent. The subjects were dehumanized, they were called logs or specimens or inferiors, never people. The people responsible always had a justification, right? Some greater good that made what they were doing okay in their minds. And the whole thing was always covered in secrecy, targeting the most vulnerable people: prisoners, the poor, minorities, children. And this table just lays it all out, doesn't it? It's so stark. You see the so-called rational goal on one side, and the devastating human cost on the other. Biowarfare research, studying syphilis, they might sound like legitimate scientific goals. But the second you take ethics and consent out of the equation, the path from research to pure atrocity is terrifyingly short. That middle column, the primary violation, that's the key. That's the moral failure that leads to the human cost. And that really brings us to the final and most important question. Yeah, we have more rules, more oversight now than ever before. But these stories prove that laws are only as strong as the people who are willing to stand up for them. When faced with political pressure, with prejudice, or with that intoxicating promise of a breakthrough, are we really truly sure that our modern systems would hold up? History is right there, serving as a permanent and chilling warning.